Please be seated. I feel like I should bring you greetings on behalf of the church in Asia after those readings. Thomas is the apostle to India. I don't know if any of you know that. There's probably no reason you should know it. But part of my parents' heritage is that they are from the churches that were founded by Thomas the apostle, Thomas the doubter that we have in the reading today. And your bulletin cover references one of those churches, the Martyrdom Church in central Kerala. Thomas doesn't get such a good rap in the history of the Western church. He is simply the doubter. In the Eastern church, particularly in India, he is the reason that there is a church. He is the apostle to us. The way we are told the story in India is that in 52 AD, Thomas, or 54, comes to India and converts 52 or 54 families, because both 52 and 54 are good numbers within the understanding of religious practice in India, like a 3 for the Trinity here, or 12 for the tribes of Israel, or 7 for the churches in Asia in Christianity. So one of those two things happened, probably. Nobody can really prove it, except that there is this group of us in central Kerala that claim this story, and there are a lot of us. We're only 2% of the population of India, which isn't really as much success as one might argue that Peter or someone else had in the West, except that it's 2% of the population of India. That's a lot of people. Thomas comes to India, and the question I've always had is, what did he say? India was not part of the Roman Empire, and as we all know, the Gospels have to do with Israel, the understanding of Israel and its liberation, its freedom historically, and it has to do with Rome, right? The Roman occupation of Israel. India is connected to none of those things now or then. Rome never occupied the southern part of India. There was no empire there that was Roman. There was no Caesar. Caesar was a trading partner. People in central Kerala made a lot of money on Caesar. That's what happened there. Rice, silk, spices for many, many, many years. He was no overwhelming force in that place. So the way we tell our story, it actually doesn't make a lot of sense, except that, and I would agree with this, that the story of Jesus and of salvation and of the salvation story of the people of Israel as worked out through Jesus is really compelling. There's something about human freedom and dignity, who we are in light of those around us, that is compelling in that story. It's a nice way to think about it. It's how most of us have thought about it. Another side of this story, if you look at it from the perspective of Thomas and the people that he comes out of, is that the people on that end in Jerusalem had to flee. 50s, right? You were getting closer and closer to the destruction of the Second Temple. There is such turmoil and foment in Jerusalem that Rome despised them, had despised them for a long time, and it's in the 60s that the last big sort of rising up comes up, and then they're defeated and dispersed. The people of Israel are dispersed all over the rest of the world. So it had been happening for a while. People had been moving. We already hear in the letters of Paul of the people dispersed, and you have it in the Hebrew scripture as well. So there were people that probably were already in South India, because there's a trade wind that comes from Syria, which is where Thomas probably would have left from. Syria, as you hear right now in the news, where people are fleeing from, that takes you to southern Kerala. And so if you need the geography of this, here's the Middle East and Israel and Syria. And if you go around the Arabian Sea, this is northern India, and you come to down there, as far down as you can go, and that's where Kerala is. And there's a trade wind that actually goes like this. The Arabian Sea is not a calm sea. It is not a pleasant place. There's still, I think, pirates in that sea today. It's a very dangerous place. And the risk you have if the trade wind isn't going your way is that you go here and die, or you go here, which is not the intention, nothing to trade this way. So it's not an easy journey. And Thomas, from what we can tell, is like all the other disciples. He's not a particularly sophisticated person. So he takes this trip probably because Jews were fleeing and had been fleeing for a long time, because Jerusalem was a terrifying place to be under empire, and probably with some people that had made a ton of money doing it. There must have been a colony of Jewish people, and there were until very recently, living in that part of India, and that had been a part of the trade. It's a way to organize your life. So he was probably going to some people that were like him, and he was probably telling a story that made sense to the people in the communities that he's from. They had had to leave Jerusalem as well. They wanted to go home as much as anyone. But who could imagine that Rome would ever be conquered? And the story of this man, Jesus, who defies what should have bound him in life and then defies death, must have been strange, but the context would have made a little sense. And maybe kind of amazing and empowering and exciting as well. What's interesting to me is, so there's a context for why he would have gone, but that's not who converted. It's not that we are our heritage is that we are people from Jerusalem that went to South India and became Christians and followed Thomas. We're Indians. I just did my DNA test hoping to find something kind of interesting about some quirky mix somewhere. And it was off the charts. I think 84% is what most South Asians are that have primarily Indian heritage. I was up in the almost 90%. We are just Indians. We've never gone anywhere. We're not that creative about mixing things up. We just live in the little spot we're in. We're pretty happy there. And even our Christianity didn't seem to cause some other mix. It didn't come from something else. So what is it that this man could have said that 400 years later, when the Syrians come on their missionary journey east, the Syrians go as far as China, the Orthodox Church at the time, and converting people and establishing the Eastern churches and the Asian churches, they find in our community our ancestors with crosses around their necks. Not lotus flowers, not the name of Jesus, right? They hadn't become Jews. It wasn't a Jewish symbol. A cross. The cross is the sign, like it would be the equivalent of wearing an orange prison jumpsuit around your neck today. It was the sign of the power of the state, that Rome could kill Jewish people at will if they were defiant. That's what it meant. This was being worn around South India, again, beyond the fringes, across the sea from the Roman Empire. And the people told a story of a man named Thomas who had come teaching about a great teacher named Jesus, and they were his followers. Now, the way it ends for Thomas is not so good, which none of these guys end up very well. He's in Kerala, he converts people, he builds 7.5 churches. We still call it a half to this day. It cannot be 8, 7.5, because 7's a good number. And he is even there in India persecuted for what he is teaching. And at the time there, it wouldn't have been that the doctrine was wrong. It's not that kind of culture. You could have as many teachers as you want. There wouldn't have been a concern around that. Somehow in what he was teaching, even there, seemed to incite people to want to defy power even in that place, so desperately that he has to flee and flees to the other end of South India, where he's martyred in Chennai on the other side, on the beach, basically, in the southeast of India. So what is the liberating power of the gospel? What is it? What is that language that defies culture and context and incites people to follow from so far away? I don't have the answer to the question, but I wonder about it. What could it possibly be? And what is it in how we tell our stories? Or when is it in our stories that we tell the side that makes it seem magical and mystical, like the 54 and the 52, and frankly, make it almost impossible to believe, right? It's almost magical that it could have happened. When is it that we do that and lose the power underneath? And I think it's always underneath. It is like wounded flesh that is the power of freedom and liberation that is at the heart of the text that we inherit. My father tells a story. He told me this just a couple of years ago. He's in his 70s. My parents live in Texas, and I grew up in Texas. And my father told me very recently that he saw Gandhi once. In my mind, as an immigrant child who grew up in this country, it would have been good to hear that story earlier on, right? I could have used that way long ago in understanding who I was supposed to be in the world. My father, in his 70s, very casually mentions, after having watched Gandhi at home on cable, I think, just as a fluke, turns around and looks at me and says, I saw Gandhi once. Well, I asked if he could tell me more about seeing Gandhi once. My father's of an age where it's possible that could have happened, but this already was sounding a little bit like Thomas to me. So he said he remembers in his hometown going with his father to see Gandhi, and he was so little that he remembers holding on to his father's leg and his clothes so he wouldn't lose him, and going with his older brother. I'm not sure his younger brother was born yet, and going to this place, and he had heard from his father already. His father wasn't sure what he thought about Gandhi. Again, we're in the far other end of India. We're in a princely state. We're not that part of India is not under British rule. The British are problematic. Things had been really rough for many generations in that part of India. People were starving, and they were Christians. So what was going to happen if we were living under the subjugation of or under the rule of another kind of religion? Would it be even worse for us as Christians? Would we need to leave? My grandfather wasn't sure what the right decision was, and having been many, many generations into this life, living under occupation, I think also wasn't sure what was possible. How can you imagine that things could be radically different than they are, and do you bring your children to it? Is it safe? You all probably saw the movie at some point as well. Remember when people gathered in big places with big walls around them? They could all be killed. And that had actually just happened around the time that my father was the age that he remembers this happening. And again, I don't know. I can't find any documentation that Gandhi was in that place at the right time, but I don't know, like Thomas, right? I don't know. But what he remembers is that as they're walking to this town, and he's holding on to his father, that the streets filled with people, and it was so packed that he was afraid that he was going to get lost. And they get to the place. It's a schoolyard, huge schoolyard, built by the missionaries, fenced, walled in, and it was so packed that you couldn't see anything. You remember standing right up next to his father, holding his leg as a little boy. And my grandfather's very, very tall, taller than most people in that community, and so my grandfather could see, and when he realized how trapped his sons were, picked them up one at a time and put them on his shoulders. You know that feeling of sitting up on a parent's shoulder, having a kid on your shoulder, that weird balance and all that crush. So he takes his oldest son, he sits up there, and my father says after a while it was his turn. His father picks him up and puts him up there, and he said, I remember that I could see over everybody. My dad was taller than almost everyone, and I could see over everyone, but there were so many people. Tens of thousands, it felt like. They were just packed, and you could feel the expectant energy among them. All of these people that, regardless of what was set up there, what was about to happen, had decided that they would be willing to risk to come into that space to hear about maybe a different way than things had always been. So my father is saying all these things, and I'm like, well, so what'd you see? It's Gandhi, right? And my father says, well, when I got up there, I wasn't really sure what I was looking for, because he was 4 or 3, right? But he remembers sitting up there, and that's the end of the story. All the stories in my family end like this. You should just know this about me. That's all he's got. But isn't it interesting that he remembers from age 3 or 4, in his 70s, standing in a space with tens of thousands of other people. What he remembers, I think, is the risk. He's gone to church, he's gone to festivals and religious programs in India that had more people than that he barely remembers. All of those people risking that maybe things could be different. And at the age that he's describing for himself, they weren't for a very long time. It got much worse before it got better. That community is overwhelmingly the descendants of the community that I am from. We are all St. Thomas Christians. That place is more than 50% us, the people who are symbolized by that cover that you have on the bulletin. Standing in that place, imagining that maybe the people around them, people like them, might be the people they should be in solidarity with as they decided what was true and right and possible for the place that they were. I think what Thomas invites us to do today, in this time in our political life, when we hear the word Syria and it's not vague, we don't have to look it up on our maps, we know exactly where it is. We know that people are fleeing and going off in every direction they can, very much like the people were in Jerusalem at the time of Thomas. We know, right, and we can imagine the places described in this reading without much thinking at all because of our current political climate. In the time that we live in right now, being in a place where we can easily imagine how dangerous it would be to take the side of the most vulnerable, to take the side of the imprisoned or the marginalized, those that wear jumpsuits, the kind that would have been put on a cross in that time, is actually kind of terrifying. Even if you and I aren't afraid here in Manhattan, you see on the news what's happening to people that speak out or try to speak out or try to claim another side or what is threatened to happen. I think Thomas has something to say to us today about asking to see the tired and wounded feet and the tired and wounded hands and the bruised sides of those that walk the way with us in this time. I think this is the underside of Thomas, that he is concrete. And it says in response to his disbelief that we who never get to see are blessed, it says. Blessed are all of us. But I think the true blessing is that Thomas asks for what he needs to believe. You and I are asked to believe in resurrection, that the forces of life overcome the forces of death. This is what we are told. It's actually really hard to believe, I think. It isn't what my life looks like most of the time, and I suspect it's not what your life looks like most of the time. And it is as improbable as going to the Church Missionary Society high school yards to see some man speak about how we who have never been free will be free. We are asked today to ask for what it is we need to believe and to reach out and find those who are weary and wounded and have something to witness for us. And you and I, those that inherit the legacy of the one that cries out, "My Lord and my God," we don't have to pretend that it's magic, that we know anything we don't know. We are just asked to ask for what we need. Amen.